Good evening, everybody, and just the warmest welcome back to the Wheeler Centre. Wow. It is so great to see you all here this evening. My name is Sally Warhaft, and this event is, of course, taking place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to each and every elder that has traversed this land and will in the future. It is a great pleasure tonight, before I start with our wonderful esteemed guest here, to be able to introduce somebody else who's going to say a few words. Martin Foley is our Minister for Health in the Victorian Government. He is with us this evening. He's been in the government since 2007, former Minister for Housing, Disability and Ageing, Mental Health, Creative Industries and Equality. But of course, since 2020, September 2020, I think, he has been really in one of the hottest seats in the country. And it's a pleasure, Martin, that you can be with us this evening to say a few words. So welcome.
Is that working? Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Peter. I'm under strict orders to go no more than 3 to 4 minutes, which is twice as long as a Gettysburg Address. So I'm sure we'll fit it all in. But I too would begin by acknowledging that we meet here on the lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and obviously acknowledge the fact that we're back here at an event and how exciting that is, and how particularly appropriate it is that we're marking this particular book, this particular conversation with one of the world's leading infectious diseases experts here at the Wheeler Centre. And can I also take this opportunity to acknowledge the new chair of the Wheeler Centre, the fantastic Julie Ligeti, who's just started as now the third chair of the Wheeler Centre, and what a great effort the Wheeler Centre puts in for all of us. I was very keen to come along tonight for a variety of reasons, to listen mostly, so I'll be quick. But there is no greater issue than that which we are, as a global community, dealing with now than what we have wrestled with over the previous 2 years. As we've seen our communities respond and be traumatised in ways that none of us, I suspect, could have imagined. Well, certainly I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago. And the efforts that we've seen in this emerging field of now literature and ideas around the pandemic and all of its different iterations, and Peter's significant contribution to it. And we know that in this diverse field of expertise that Peter brings, that he won't be so modest, I'm sure. But what we have really here in Australia, in the institute that takes his name, and which his book gives us a little potted history of its coming together, is an extraordinary contribution to the global field of infection prevention and control. We've now seen Peter as the original rock star epidemiologist, the first of many that have followed in his footsteps, and the fact that our relatively good position nationally, indeed internationally, in how the global pandemic has been managed is touched upon so well in his book, which is essentially, particularly part 2, a combination of all of the blogs and pieces of work that he's put together. But in putting it together, what Peter touches on in that part 2, in one of his sections there, is where he talks about the lessons to be learnt. And he points to the fact that science and evidence and rational decision-making and the inheritance of the traditions of rigorous scientific undertakings really is the servant of the community that's a part of. But if we've learned anything over the past 2 years, it's that that very foundation of science has been the subject of dispute, that evidence and fake news and alternative facts and the whole undermining of that evidence-based approach to science, to public policy decision-making is a real challenge. And Peter's calm, measured contribution to that debate, I think, is something that allows us to all reflect on. But then he does also talk about the fact that perhaps he, like many of us, have underestimated the human component of how we've responded to this global pandemic in ways, again, that none of us could have imagined. And in Adam Tooze's book, Shutdown, which I'd strongly recommend, even though it's kind of a very economic focus, the coming together of some of Peter's thoughts and some of the contributions there talk about how in that human element, despite the massive efforts of essentially in an organised, public health inspired way, we shut down so much of the globe for good public health reasons, we let loose a whole range of other tendencies and measures. And Peter's book and the fact that those other tendencies that undermine the basis of what Peter's whole story is, gives us cause to ponder. And it's, if anything, the message I took from that is that it's inequality that thrives for a pandemic's opportunities when it comes to that non-scientific, non-evidence-based approach. And I, for one, truly value Peter's contribution, not only to the infectious diseases community of the globe, the leading role he's taken in that community here in Australia, but indeed how he comes to personify that hard-working group who have really been at the core of steering us through the last 2 years. So I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of those scientific, public health, infection prevention and control communities and the people of Victoria. Can we thank you, Peter, for your great work, and we very much look forward to this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And Peter, welcome. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room, of course, knows about your 1996 Nobel Prize for your immunology research. You've written a great deal, books including The Incidental Tourist and Pandemics, What Everyone Needs to Know, 2013. But the book that prompted the invitation last year, we were supposed to be doing this, and in fact our event was cancelled on a day that a lockdown that Martin instigated started, so thanks very much for that. But we did it, we're here, and honestly, the last time I was in this seat was on the 10th of March, 2020, and my guest was Bob Brown, and we were discussing the bushfires. And in fact, we discussed this virus. That was the day Australia had its 100th case, and it was also the day that the Prime Minister declared it a pandemic, which I think was in that very small window of time when the Prime Minister was on the front foot, because it was actually the day before the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. So it was a long time ago, and I remember Bob Brown, who of course trained as a doctor. He really frightened me. It was the last time I was here. It was the last time I had dinner out for a long time that night. And I wonder, Peter, to begin, is just your broad reflections, and welcome again, it's so great to see you here, your broad reflections on how you're feeling 2 years on.
Well, thanks, Sally, and thanks, Minister, for your kind words. How am I feeling 2 years on? Well, I underestimated the pandemic, and I think we've all learned an enormous amount. And I had written an earlier book about pandemics, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's a kind of Q&A format that Oxford University Press publishes, and My book didn't sell particularly well because I didn't do a sort of disease and death, all be scared to death sort of thing, like these sort of books usually are. You know, shock horror, we're all going to die with black stuff coming out our nose. But a bit of that has happened, hasn't it? And so it was vastly outsold in that series, What Everyone Needs to Know, by things like the Catholic Church, What Everyone Needs to Know. We've all been struggling with that all our life. And so, of course, what I vastly underestimated was the social element. I mean, I'd read, you know, if we got a pandemic of very bad flu, and we all thought flu would be the one that had come along, and it'd cost trillions of dollars. We all knew that, but you don't really, without any background in that area, calculate the social cost and what it really means for people. And I thought, well, you know, we've got all this great online communication and internet and email, so we'll be able to stay at home if we have to. But we all understand that now very well, I think. Mm. And I think the minister was alluding to the point that one of the chapters in the book is really an essay I wrote for the Saturday paper saying that we've really got to learn from this, because not just on the infectious disease front or the science front or making vaccines and all the stuff, we've learned an enormous amount, but we've also got to learn, you know, what were the best things to do from the economic and the disease control perspectives. Did we get it right? Did we do it the best way? Did other people do better? You know, we all think we did do very well because deaths are way down. If we'd had the numbers of deaths that they've had in the United States, just on a proportional basis, we would have had easily 60, 70,000, more than that, dying in Australia, and I think we've had about 5,000 or 6,000. So the fact that we did all get together, and I think one of the really good things for me about the pandemic is the way I'd sort of thought we'd lost a bit of that Australian spirit of looking out for each other. That I'd always thought it was very Australian, and especially after spending a lot of time in the United States, that we do to some extent look out for each other. We have an idea of collective responsibility. And I think both the way the politics worked and the way the population worked and accepted what was happening, though, you know, some fragmentation, I think really gave me a much better sense of my own country, which I'm kind of pleased about.
It was remarkable to me that until the vaccines arrived, that all of the measures to protect people for public safety, how archaic they were. It was like, I mean, the Journal of the Plague Year, or if you watch the Tudors, I mean, these measures just have not altered, have they, in
not all
so
that
many
much.
years?
Of course, they didn't understand the plague. We're talking about the 17th century. We didn't understand what an infectious disease was until the middle of the 19th century with the work of Louis Pasteur. We thought infections came from miasmas and the plague doctors, if you see, there are illustrations of Venetian plague doctors with a kind of a leather beak-like mask. So they were, the idea that it was in the air, I think it may have come from malaria and swamps and where there's lots of mosquitoes and stuff. So, but practically, it wasn't that different. I mean, exclusion, shutting down, villages shut down and managed to avoid it and so forth.
The Doherty Institute was the first to sequence and grow the coronavirus in a cell culture outside of China and share it with the world. And this was a game changer for diagnosis, particularly. You were supposed to be retired, of course, at that time, so big fail there, Peter. But tell us...
I failed retirement, Sally.
You did, yeah.
Abysmal. A D minus for retirement.
Tell us about those early days at Doherty and what you got to do.
Yeah, I should clarify my role at the Doherty Institute is I'm the patron. That's my name's on the building. I helped, I think, get the money for it from Kevin Rudd, who gave us $80 million as part of his the economic meltdown thing. And always in Victoria, we get fantastic assistance from the Victorian government, which is very committed to the idea that science and technology is part of Victoria's future in a very substantial way. And we've had wonderful support ever since since I've been back, which is 20 years. And so, so I helped get the money, but I have no power there. I don't direct it. That's the wonderful Sharon Lewin, who you will have seen on TV, who's really an enormously smart and wonderful person. And the role of a patron is you shut up until someone asks you to do something or tells you to do something, then you do it. But I wasn't particularly conscious of this new virus coming out. I'd read a bit about it, and of course, coronavirus, that's like the original SARS, and I thought, well, this could be problematic, but I was obsessed. I was finishing a book. It was my first non-science book. It's on war and tennis. And it's coming out in August. So I'm just doing the edits now. And it's kind of fun, and it's part family story and part the usual academic thing. I've gone into far too much depth on everything. But and so I was kind of a bit detached. And then our executive officer, Andrea Fisher, Tim Fisher's niece, actually, asked me to attend the 3 times a week meetings they were having. And I suddenly realized, hell, this is real. And by this time, Mike Catton and Julian Drews had, as Sally said, they'd made a diagnostic test. The virus sequence was published mid-January, largely at the assistance of University of Sydney, Eddie Holmes, who was collaborating with the Chinese and is one of the great authorities on this sort of stuff. And so we had a diagnostic test, very specific PCR test, and they'd isolated the virus and distributed it worldwide because they'd had a lot of trouble getting the original SARS virus. And you need live virus. You need it for doing what we call the virus neutralization test in cell culture. You also need it if you're trying, as you start to develop vaccines, you start out with things like mice and ferrets and stuff, and you do live animal challenges. And you can't do that if you don't have any live virus. So distributing it globally was really important right at the beginning. And then, the politicians basically did the right thing. I mean, the federal government shut down international travel and so forth very quickly, which certainly protected a lot of people. Europe didn't, America didn't. Virus was up and away before they reacted. We dodged that.
I went for a walk around the precinct where the institute is when I was thinking about tonight, and I mean, there are so many other institutes. It really is a precinct, isn't it?
Yeah, the Parkville precinct is fantastic. We're in that old motel that used to have the spiral staircase. That was knocked down after we had to take it to VCAT to get it knocked down. That was knocked down, and that's the building. So it's kind of a modest Brownie building.
It's so modest. I mean, you look at it and you just can't believe what has gone on in there.
And it looks kind of Brownie because it's built to great eco specifications. It's very energy efficient and all that sort of stuff. But it's a very expensive building because it's got level 4 laboratories. I mean, things that are designed to contain things like Ebola and stuff like that. And then on the other corner is the new Peter Mac, which was built after us. I sort of watched it out my window, and then Royal Melbourne Hospital on the diagonal corner and the medical school on the other corner. And then just up the street's the Neuroscience Institute, the Meyer building and Dr. Dax and all that stuff. Yeah.
What in that building would the people who work there have? I mean, it's well funded. It's looked after, the Doherty Institute, in a way that not everywhere clearly is. But there must have been things that staff just would have loved to have had. Were there things that were missing that would have enabled their work to be simpler?
The thing we were missing that we didn't design into the building was a high security animal facility. I mean, you have to do some animal work when you're developing a vaccine to look at the immune response and all the rest of it, and to test out ideas that you can't only do in mice or something like that. And though the initial virus, the very first strains didn't grow in mice, the ones that came along later, just by natural change, actually did. And so that experiment was possible. There was a facility at the Hall Institute, and they were very generous, and they did a lot of work with us. And we've actually set up a facility with La Trobe University, which had an agrobio thing, which we've been able to reconfigure. But that was missing. There will be a facility. There's now going to be a further development of the institute to the new Australian Centre for Infectious Disease, which has been heavily backed by Victorian government. And there will be some capacity for that. Otherwise, we had pretty much what we needed technologically in the Institute. It was high tech, built to later specifications, but most of all, we had fantastic people. We recruited Cantor Subarao from the US National Institutes of Health, the thing that's run by Tony Fauci, who's to head our Global Influenza Institute, the Centre for the WHO Centre for Immunology, one of 6 worldwide. Cantor had been already recruited, and her husband Siddhartha, who's a clinical infectious disease guy as well. They've both been fantastic, and Cantor was actually the only one who'd really worked with coronaviruses in primates, for instance, during the early SARS thing. So we just had great people already there, and of course our institute is unique in that it includes, it's not just University of Melbourne, it's also Melbourne Health, which is kind of runs Royal Melbourne Hospital and all those things. And so we're dual badged, and it's also the Victorian Infectious Disease Reference Lab, which is state government, the Molecular Microbiology Diagnostic, which is a bacterial diagnostic, who was just appointed a new director who really wanted to have great gene sequencing facilities. So that Ben Howden has done, they've done all the genomics on the virus until very recently. Vidral's doing more now. So it's this combination of and also the clinical doctors who care for the patients across at Royal Melbourne. So this combination of the practical end of infectious disease, this is why the Institute was built, that was the idea behind it. We would combine the academic department in the university together with the practical infectious disease that actually goes out, helps people, and tries to deal with these problems in the community. And that's been, that's the strength of it. So that's partly the book's about that. Of course, when the new Infectious Disease Institute is finished, we'll also bring up the Burnett Institute. Now, the Burnett's a bit like us. They're infectious disease people, and like Sharon Lewin, they've been very much into AIDS. She's an AIDS researcher and doctor. But they also have what's wonderful harm reduction programs. There's a big social science component to what they do. And they've been very involved in harm reduction right through Asia, Africa, and so forth, particularly with respect to AIDS. So that will add a whole new dimension to what we do, not just the lab science, the clinical doctors, the diagnostic people, but also the actual social science aspect, which is so important.
There's a great collegiality, it seems, in medicine and science that isn't, everywhere else, is it? Is it formalised in a way? Like, did the the bosses of all these places sort of meet, or regularly, or speak regularly in a formal way? Is it mostly informal?
I think it's mostly informal, but we do have a sort of Parkville precinct type thing, and through Bio 21, which is an earlier thing, again coming from state government. We linked a lot of these things together as kind of the Parkville precinct, and then that became a bigger thing, which also incorporates the other universities, Monash and so forth. But Melbourne itself is a very, in the science sense, and I think as a city, it's a very collegial city. It actually works. People work together very much. I mean, they also oppose each other. I mean, there are these tribes that are called football teams, so there is this tribal structure, but Sydney's not like that. Sydney doesn't work well together at all, actually. Yeah, but Monash and Melbourne, they steal people from us. We sometimes steal them back. I mean, it's just basically we're all part of the same family, even though the mighty Yarra River separates us.
Your scientific expertise is in virus pathogenesis and immunity. I mean, this pandemic is right up your alley, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why I wasn't able to hide.
Yeah, and I've got a little quote from your book. You write, "The disease we call COVID-19 is a confrontation between a very small, rapidly multiplying invader, SARS-CoV-2, and the, by comparison, enormous, long-lived, slowly reproducing, multicellular, multi-organ system we call a human being." I wonder what now you find most interesting about this particular clash.
Oh, what's most interesting, I think it all should give us a certain humility as we think of our own self-importance, that a tiny speck of material, we say the virus wants to. The virus doesn't want anything. All that drives the virus is to multiply and infect other people, because that's the way it survives. It's classic evolution at work. And we've seen it evolve. We've evolved, and we've now got Omicron. So it's something, of course, that's been in my sort of consciousness all my adult life. But I think it's now in the consciousness of many of the rest of us who may have not seen this in quite the same way. But just this tiny bit of genetic information that's cost trillions of dollars, that kill people that we knew, but I don't think the disruption of it is just extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And all these things we thought were robust collapsed in front of it.
Yes, with one tiny little speck.
So, one of the things you learn as a professional scientist, someone who's trying to sort of push the envelope. We fail a lot. That's characteristic of people who are doing basic science. You get things wrong, especially in biology, which is so complex. And it's so complex because everything has evolved. And in evolved systems, unlike the design system of the engineer, you design a bridge and you design it not to fall down. An evolved system, it's like an architect who's constantly building a new building on top of old foundations and has to adapt to them because you evolve from what's there. And so that's why biology is so complicated and doesn't always make sense, in the sense of this would not be the best way to do it, but it's the way that evolution has determined it could be done. So it's this co-evolution of parasite and person has always fascinated me, especially with some of the big viruses that live in us all the time, the Epstein-Barr virus and the cold sore virus, which are viruses when we get infected. We never get rid of them. They're in our body for the rest of our lives.
You write throughout the book about language. You say over and over again, words matter. And it's been really interesting to many of us, but it must have been very interesting to you to watch the language of science and medicine be absorbed by everyone. Everyone became some version of epidemiologist. I'm really, I'm very responsible in what I write. I've been writing this weekly thing for the website. I've just done number 100. I never thought I'd be a weekly columnist. I can tell you, it's really hard work, actually. And the really good ones are in the book, and the rest of them, they just got more and more boring. But the book's got all the good stories I had in my head, and it's got some really, there's a good chapter that's, the most cited chapter is one on slime, rime, and snot. And slime is very important in respiratory infections. But I think that I'm also on Twitter, and I started out with about 18,000 followers on. I now have 109. Yeah, but that had nothing to do with the virus, did it, really?
Well, apparently not.
I'm joking.
But I tweet about politics and about all sorts of things, and I get told off regularly for my opinions, and I get pointed out what a fool I am. But I get told off for the science too. I get it told by people who don't identify themselves that I don't know anything about science. It's very interesting. I'm quite fascinated.
If you're on Twitter, Peter has one of the great tweet. I follow you on Twitter, and it's thoroughly entertaining.
Yes, well, I must say I block a lot of people because there are some pretty confused people out there, shall we say. to be nice.
I'd like to think I wasn't too. I was, on and off, very confused throughout the pandemic, and I'm somebody that struggles with that side of my brain, that science. I just think we've got red blood cells and white blood cells, so why isn't our blood pink? I have to operate on a level of precision, I suppose, about how things are explained, and I've loved trying to come to understand it.
Was it Evelyn Waugh who described the so-called white man in the tropic as the pinko grey man in the tropics?
Is that right?
Yes, I think pinko, not politically, but
the language of science and medicine, it has a deep history, and you take just the word immunity. from the Latin,
It comes-
without tax, which, Minister, I'm shocked no one from government ever nicked for a poster. I mean, do you know the background of that word in relation to
Well,
medicine?
I've been assured it's from the Genio Immunium, who were soldiers who'd returned from some of the wars of the Roman state. And when they came back to Rome for a time, they were exempt from tax. And they were the Genio Immunium. They answered to the goddess Minerva. And I don't know how long that went on, but basically that's, the political right. I mean, their job is to make rich people part of the Genio Immunium, so they pay no tax. But my political views are very obvious, and I don't conceal them. I grew up in Queensland when it was a Labor state, if you can imagine. It still is, isn't it? It's a Labor state again. Yeah, sure.
And a complete coincidence that the minister would be invited tonight. Because
I think at the state government level, with the exception of one person, Campbell Newman, it's genuinely much better. Yeah. I think federal politics is very strange in Australia, partly because of Canberra. And I'm not sure how much Canberra is responsible for the politicians or how much the politicians are responsible for Canberra, but it's an odd place.
How have you found the communication of what's happened with this disease in the media, in the public sphere, in Australia compared to elsewhere?
I think it's been pretty good. I think the journalists on the whole have been pretty responsible. Essentially, when we were at the peak of the pandemic, before it, to some extent, politics started to creep back in again, which was inevitable, of course. We're a democracy, and democracies are messy. But in that earlier stage, I was talking to people on Sky News and the Murdoch media and everyone and all and sundry, the Saturday paper, the monthly, these sort of things, and everyone was trying to do their best, I think. And really the reporting was very good. And I wasn't involved in the public policy sphere. I'm not an epidemiologist, and I decided at the beginning that I would talk about the science, that my role, if I had anything in the pandemic, was to try and explain some of the science to people so they could understand what it was all about, and that's what I've tried to do. But I've stayed away from the whole business about lockdowns and public policy and so forth. That's my epidemiology colleagues who they don't determine the lockdowns, they provide advice to government, and government asks them for advice because what modelling is their thought experiments based on the best data that very smart people do, trying to predict what's going to happen. And so, but again, I actually get accused. I'm told that I should spend the rest of my life in a small cell, or suffer worse because of all the lockdowns I've caused. I've never even talked to a politician about it. I mean, it's the modelling team led by Jodie McVernon. And of course, Jodie doesn't decide to lock communities down. It's the politicians who take advice. Scientists, Winston Churchill said it. I mean, scientists, as far as politics are concerned, we elect representatives. That's their job to make decisions. And scientists are always untapped but never on top. That's the way it should be. And if you know some scientists, you would agree with that absolutely. There are scientists I know who should never be controlling anything.
I want to, I guess, get into a bit about the actual disease, because this is, something you talk about better than anybody else in the country. We can't talk about all of it, but perhaps two aspects, because I feel like people still describe this as a sort of respiratory disease. And in my reading and understanding of the complication of COVID, the two areas that particularly interest me are clotting and inflammation.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could give us your version, or your thoughts on just those two things.
Yeah, I mean when we started out, and this is as true of the scientific community as everybody else, we all thought of it as kind of like influenza because it manifested as a respiratory infection, and the the people who do imaging, you know, they put you in the machine and they sort of look at your lungs and stuff, were describing what they call ground glass consolidations, which really look horrible. They're inflammation, they're virus-induced damage, and they're all the cells, the white blood cells flooding in to try and control the infection. And you get these horrible looking, what we call a lesion or inflammatory damage or whatever. So that was the initial thinking about it. This is a respiratory infection. It's not flu because it's different in various ways. And that's how we thought of it. But then it was realized that unlike influenza is an infection of the respiratory tract. You get infected up through the nose, just as you do with COVID. And it goes down into your lungs, and if you get it really bad, you get a terrible pneumonia. It can be lethal. Any of us who've had flu know just how bad it can be as a disease. You can make you really, really sick, and it kills people, and like COVID, it particularly kills old people, but it also kills babies and little kids who don't have any cross-reactive immunity. So that's how we thought of it. But then it was realized it's actually in the blood. And flu doesn't do that. Flu in humans, in birds it can go in the blood, and it's what we call systemic. But COVID can get into the blood, and once a virus is in the blood, it's in the body's superhighway. So it goes everywhere. There's a blood-brain barrier which will tend to keep things out, and we're still not clear what's going on in the brain. We don't know how much infections there are in the brain, maybe not a lot, but there are things going on in the brain, that's clear. And the body responds. So that means with COVID, the virus can get into your heart and can get into your kidneys. That's why people with diabetes are so susceptible, because the kidneys in diabetics are not in great shape. And so people who get into hospital and get really sick, they can have heart damage, they can have kidney damage, various other damage. And some of that damage, of course, is permanent and will compromise them for the rest of their life, the ones, particularly older people who get very sick. And that's true of flu too. Older people who get very sick often don't fully recover. And so, but the other thing that was realized is that we thought with influenza, you know, the lung is a very, very delicate organ. And because it works, its function is to get oxygen from the air and give off carbon dioxide from us. And the carrier, of course, is the hemoglobin in red blood cells. The hemoglobin carries oxygen in the red blood cell to our other tissues, which we need to live, and it picks up carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct, takes it back to the lung and pushes it back out again. And that happens because of the very, very delicate nature of what we call the terminal alveoli of the bronchi. And these are very delicate. You've got just a couple of layers of cells where this gas exchange occurs. And once that's damaged, and you can't do that, and in flu, what kills you really is those terminal alveoli fill up with fluid. And you just drown, essentially. But with COVID, it's not just that. In fact, less than that, there's little micro clots in the blood vessels. And so it's a clotting disease as well. Now, mostly people don't die from stroke, but you can get people, young people particularly, can die from acute heart attacks and strokes. Not that common, but it does happen. But there's also, we've just had a report in the Journal of American Medical Association that basically for a year after, people who've recovered from COVID are at increased risk of heart attacks. So if you've had COVID, just be careful. I mean, you may have thought it was relatively mild, but just for the next year or so, just don't push yourself too hard physically. And if you feel any, you know, I'm not a doctor here, I'm a vet actually. You don't want to get medical advice from a vet. But honestly, really, I think we should just be a bit careful with it, because we don't fully understand this disease. Where does our understanding come from? You know, it comes from influenza, then it comes from the data we've got with COVID, and we've only lived with that for a couple of years, so that's really fragmentary. Then it comes from years of experiments in mice and so forth. I mean, we can't sort of take human beings and rip out their lymph nodes and stuff. We tend to do that with mice. So when I talk about how the disease works, I'm putting together a story from all sorts of sources to give you the best explanation I can of what's going on. Inflammation. Inflammation it's the white blood cells, the T cells, the B cells, and monocytes and neutrophils, all sorts of different cells we've known for ages. These all come flooding into the site where the virus is growing. Some come in very early before the specific immune response gets going. And some of those cells are pushing out very toxic molecules that are there to try and control an infection in a very non-specific way. And that's part of the problem with chronic inflammation. And it's the problem with rheumatoid arthritis, it's the problem with multiple sclerosis, is you get cells in a particular place pushing out toxic molecules when they shouldn't be. And I think that's what may be going on in the brain with COVID, for instance, with long COVID, that part of that. So basically, what we've been learning, especially over the last couple of decades, that chronic inflammation is very bad. It drives aging changes, it does all sorts of things to us. And if we can keep that inflammation damped down, and COVID is a very inflammatory disease.
Yeah, what you just said before about that journal article, I mean, it shouldn't surprise me, and perhaps, but, when you're sitting here saying, be careful, even if you've had it, mildly for 12 months, how much of this kind of research do you think is going to be coming out as we learn more about the longer term?
That sort of stuff comes out as the doctors watch the disease, they study the disease, they deal with the disease, they report incidence, an increase of heart attacks above background. Of course, the anti-vaxxers all blame it on the vaccine, but the infection is infinitely worse. I mean, there has been a clotting problem in a very few people with those adenovirus-based vaccines like AstraZeneca. And of course, there's this myocarditis, pericarditis phenomenon that's kind of rare, but a lot of people have had a bad experience, especially on the Pfizer vaccine for 3, 4, 5 days and stuff. There are things to be sorted out here, but they're great vaccines. There are things we don't understand very well, and so there are things to be that we'll get better at it, I guess. And so, but there's still a lot to understand. I'm still struggling with the whole long COVID thing. Really, what is going on? I've been meaning to write about it, and I keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off because it's still not all that clear.
What's your sense of it, though? If you were going to be writing about it, what would you be writing?
I mean, there's an article in that great academic journal, the Washington Post, today, saying there's some evidence coming through. The brain is very complicated, as we know, but the nerve cells but there are other cells there, not just the nerve cells. There's what we call the astrocytes, and there's a little cell called the microglial cell. These are all the supportive tissue of the brain, and the nutrients tissue and stuff. And it seems there's something going on with the microglia. Now, I actually started as a neuropathologist, so I know all this stuff, which is pretty unusual, actually, for someone with my background. But there are also some of the white blood cells, the monocytes, can come into the brain, and they look like the microglia in a microscope and stuff. And whether they've been activated by the infection and they're hanging out in the brain and they're producing stuff, which is actually giving this fog that the people complain of with long COVID. It'll take a while to work out, really it will.
I wonder your thoughts too about the very strange role of children in this disease, because I have 2 young children, my twins, who were 4 when this thing started. They turned 7 last week, so they did prep and grade 1 during the lockdowns. And my keenness, like every parent, to keep them well. And we got right through until the very last day of the last lockdown, and they were sent home as primary contacts from an on-site school day that they'd had. And they both got Delta. And you have it's changed a bit now, of course, because the virus is, it's become, this was pretty early on, October, November last year. A profound sense of failure as a parent when your kids, I think I felt that anyway, that I hadn't been able to.
Honestly, you shouldn't.
I couldn't help it. I didn't get it. I lived with them maskless for 2 weeks, for 4 weeks. I did nothing once they'd got it to protect myself.
This parental guilt thing.
It is unending.
Look,
isn't
honestly,
it?
I was head of Department of Immunology in a paediatric cancer hospital, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, Memphis, Tennessee, probably one of the great kids' cancer hospitals. And one of the real problems that the doctors had to deal with is that people blamed themselves for the kids getting cancer. Now, to some extent, you can blame yourself a bit if you get lung cancer and you've smoked all your life. Or maybe if you've eaten pickled herring 4 times a day and you get stomach cancer. But you can't, there's nothing that you could do in the sense of a child that would cause that child to get cancer.
No.
These are mutations, they're random. But people blame themselves. I shouldn't have given them burnt toast, or, they shouldn't have had Snickers bars. I mean, it's all crap. Kids can eat anything. I mean, they're just rubbish cans on one leg.
It doesn't stop you, though. But what about, I mean, particularly when you sit there and we don't know the consequences. We don't know the long term. Because I've found that children's part in this has all been very strange. Unlike flu, children didn't get it seriously. We didn't know for so long whether or not they were little vectors, that they were...
They weren't. With the early strains, kids really didn't seem to be important in the transmission cycle. That came through fairly quickly. Whereas with flu, I mean, you can map flu. Flu in the UK, for instance, the incidence falls off with summer school vacation and comes back again after the vacation's over. And it's not just the weather. It's actually the kids are bringing the virus into the home. And that's very clear. Not so with COVID. It wasn't. There's a bit more that happening now, I think, with the Omicron. And Omicron, there's a bit of anecdotal reporting almost that it seems to occasionally cause more severe disease in children. I think a young child died actually recently. But again, it's not primarily, and we think it might be because of the interferon status or something like that that's different. But
and would you assume that kids that are getting it now by the thousands, that as they grow up, the disease is endemic, they will get it time and time again?
I would suspect so. I mean, we're kind of thinking that the virus will stick around and there'll be reinfection, but every time, I mean, when people do get infected and boosted and vaccinated, I think we're building up a kind of general immunity. I'm really amazed that the vaccines are still working, really, because the virus has changed a lot. But it's clear that triple vaccination is stopping people from, it's not stopping people from being infected, but it's stopping people from getting really sick and dying in the main. I mean, you'll see reports that the people who are actually getting very sick and dying, 60% of them are vaccinated. But if you look at our population in those very vulnerable age groups, the older people, 95%, 99% even have had 2 doses of vaccine. And so the fact that you're getting people dying, these are people who are at the end of life and have other issues and stuff. And so, and the unvaccinated are still dying at a much higher rate. And the vaccines are still doing a reasonable job.
You've described the pandemic as there's a sense that it's a more benign sort of dress rehearsal, I suppose. That weren't the words you used, but this idea that it's a kind of trial run.
I said that early on when I was underrating it a bit, and I think the proof of the pudding will be what's happened with the long COVID and long-term effects. I'm hoping that won't be too many people, but for a while there, it looked like a lot of people were suffering from this. But that data's not clear yet. We need longitudinal studies of cohorts of patients, groups of patients. And one of the problems with long COVID, it's been a bit of a problem with the ME chronic fatigue thing too. At least with COVID, we know the trigger. We know the virus has triggered it. But one of the problems is there's a lot of self-reporting. And so you really need people in properly controlled studies where they're being looked at by doctors and you can study them in the long term. So COVID may actually open up that whole problem of chronic fatigue, which has been a real difficulty for patients and doctors, because often you can't really find something wrong. And it's frustrating for the doctor and particularly frustrating for the patient, though the patient's really not well. And it's a bit the same with long COVID. I mean, they do a lot of tests on these people. The standard tests don't tell them why they're not well.
What are the other diseases that might
Epstein-
benefit,
Epstein-Barr virus can trigger, the kissing disease, infectious mononucleosis. That's a virus we never get rid of, so it's always in our body, and it's always reactivating a bit. But you can get that chronic fatigue after that. Various other virus triggers have been suspected, but not necessarily implicated. And with COVID, I think we've got a really good chance to try and pull this whole thing apart and try and understand it, because we do know what the trigger is, and we know when it was triggered.
Reading your book, you realise the level of research that must be going on around the world of just the most curious things linked to the virus, and the detail of research. And you asked the question in your book, has anyone thought to ask if severe COVID-19 is more common in those who experienced early tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy? I thought, are you the only person in the world to have asked that question? Who else has asked?
Well, the basis of this is, that everything goes on. The immune response is all developed in our lymph nodes. So when you get the vaccine in your arm, the whole immune response is going on in what we call the axillary lymph nodes. These are the filter stations. The lymph is the drain, while the blood is the superhighway of the body that gets nutrients around and all the rest of it. The fluid goes out into the tissues, and the lymph is the drainage system. It doesn't have a pump. It doesn't have a heart, but we pump it with our muscular activities. That's why if you're really inactive on a plane, for instance, your legs can swell, because lymph is accumulating. You're not moving around and pumping it with your muscles. But the lymph drains through filter stations called the lymph nodes, and that's where immune responses happen. So the tonsils and adenoids and so forth, the people of my generation, nobody was left with them. It was a very good surgical procedure. The general practitioners did it. It was a good income stream. And the kids were happy because you got ice cream and lemonade afterwards, which in my period was the post-war period when those things were very scarce. And so they were all ripped out. They're the lymphoid tissue of the neck and the nose region and stuff. There are other lymph nodes down here and do the job. But I've often wondered whether, and we just had a discussion on our weekly. It's now 2 times a weekly group section where all the heads of the various groups meet. We just had a discussion. Is it better to get the second vaccine shot in the other arm or not? None of us knows. We all have various theoretical reasons for thinking it's probably better to get it in the other arm. And maybe you should get one in that arm and then one in that arm, and the next one should be in your butt. And, that's...
What did you do?
I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember for the 4th shot which arm I had it in.
I mean, it does. I mean,
there's a very practical question, isn't it? Really?
There's so many, aren't there? Like,
Well, we don't think about them, and actually, COVID, because of the money that's been available and because of the focus on the immune system, we're going to know vastly more about how the human immune system works than we knew before. I mean, it really has been fantastic. We've learned an enormous amount very, very quickly, and that'll spill over into all sorts of other things.
Is Australia doing what it should be doing in that capacity with its research focus, where the funding goes?
I think it's been doing pretty well. I mean, actually what's been very useful, apart from we've had great support in Victoria from state government and various, I think, other state governments too, but the Medical Research Futures Fund that Tony Abbott set up. For a while, that looked very much like another sort of pork barrel exercise in the way it was used. But it provided a resource that actually was pulled in very effectively. for COVID. So it's been actually very useful.
What about the state of our universities?
Well, that's a different story. I mean, the universities took a terrible hit with the loss of international students, and of course they didn't get the those payments. What was it? I forget the name of it.
The JobKeeper.
The JobKeeper. So we've lost a lot of young people. I think the universities have had major damage. I'm really very, very concerned. And basically grant funding, research grant funding has been falling steadily. John Howard was a great enthusiast for science. He actually doubled the medical research funding, and maybe twice actually, and also the Australia Research Council, the funds on the other side. He actually liked science, and he would go to there was the Prime Minister's science thing that he would go to regularly, and he enjoyed it. It was that old style. He had that old style conservative respect for data and science and hard work and all that sort of stuff. But that's totally eroded on that side of politics, and basically the universities are looked at as not friendly, and they've taken a terrible hit. I'm really worried about the Australian university system once this impetus of funding goes off, because we're losing. And of course, the other thing that's been problematic is, the climate scientists are all saying, you've got an emergency, you've got to do something. One way to shut them up is don't fund them. I mean, that's basically assassination of science, basically, when you don't fund it.
Why do you think that is in Australia, that we can accept the validity of the science for this disease, be implored by every level of government to follow it, but climate science gets treated as something for debate? Medical
science is always kind of easy. I think, with respect to the Minister, it's not a bad portfolio to have. Most people don't hate you. I mean, there's problems. There's always going to be underfunding problems with hospitals and all sorts of things. There's always going to be difficulties. But it's not one of those ministries where you send people to die. And look, don't trust my political instincts. I'm hopeless. I failed at university politics.
That's incredible. I guess universities were better than
university politics is so bitter because it matters so little. This is internal university politics. Okay. Yeah. But basically, everyone wants to have good health, and even right-wing politicians, they're totally disconnected from reality. They want to live forever. Rupert Murdoch wants to live forever. The bugger might, for all we know. And so they're all happy about funding medical science, that's fine. But climate science, I mean, basically it brings us into major conflict with a major source of Australian earnings and income. So it's a very conflicted and difficult area. Nobody should underestimate the political difficulty of handling it. It really is problematic, and because it involves, shutting down whole communities or redirecting them, and people do not like change. And one thing as a scientist you get used to is the only thing that is certain is change. And I think The Leopard, that great novel by Lampedusa, if everything is to remain the same, everything must change.
Yes. I read that last year, actually, during a lockdown.
It has to. I mean, you can't, in a rapidly evolving situation where the realities are changing, and we can see with climate change it's happening very fast. I mean, you have to change. You can't keep doing the same thing. But it's just such an enormously difficult economic and political equation, and it takes real courage and real leadership to take it forward. We know what works. I mean, pricing carbon actually worked in Australia, and it can work if it's done properly. But the problem with a lot of these schemes is they get into the hands of the finance people, and it just becomes another earning opportunity.
Do you think, just to finish up, that, the pandemic, it feels like we're in a new stage, a better one, in that we're able,
I think.
Can you, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but, what's your best guess?
Well, we're all hoping. We all said at the beginning that if it was like flu, what happened with the 1918-19 flu pandemic, which killed 50 million people at least in a world population that's about a quarter the size of today. So this is infinitely worse. So my sort of statement that, is this a trial run? And it could be. I mean, we could have something infinitely worse. The worst things are not the terrible diseases that kill everybody, because you dump on them quickly and shut them down. The worst type of disease is one like we've had, where it's a mild infection in many, so they transmit, but it's very severe in others. So it is a bad disease in that sense. So, but basically we said, well, 1918-19 flu, it went for 2 years almost. We didn't get it till 1919, and it was already milder. And then the virus did stick around. We didn't know it at the time because we didn't isolate the virus. We had no tests for it. The first influenza viruses weren't isolated till 1931. So, whereas with this one, the virus was detected in the December. We had the gene sequence.
In January.
In January, we were making vaccines from January. So basically, it is Omicron, that sort of milder variant that will see the end of this acute thing, or are we going to be hit by something else? And of course, that will be much more difficult because people have come to the view that Omicron is milder. It's not that much milder, actually, as you know. I mean, you had it. Yeah, it can make you really quite sick.
No, it was horrible.
Yeah, that's. But you're okay. You haven't got any chronic.
Depends who you ask, but yes.
You
Happy to be here.
You
Yes.
seem the same.
I'm very happy. Very happy. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to
I'm
be
not sure happiness is good.
See, maybe I'm not okay.
No. I've speculated about writing a novel. I have absolutely no creative writing skills whatsoever, so it will never happen. But my novel would be that someone does genetically engineer a virus that makes everyone happy. And when everyone's happy, of course, they lose all acquisitive aims. They don't feel a need to own a Maserati or a mansion in Brighton or the latest Emiglio, Zaguglia or whatever it is, clothes or something. So the global economic system collapses because we're no longer into endless consumption of useless crap. And basically what the hierarchy in the United States gets onto very quickly is making a vaccine against this happy virus.
Yeah. Oh, Peter, it's been such a joy to have you here to talk about your book. You can string a sentence together, that's for sure. He got in here a little bit earlier and has pre-signed some copies if you'd like to buy An Insider's Plague Year, thanks to the Paperback Bookshop as ever. It's great to see you back here as well. And to all of you, thanks for coming tonight. You've been a fantastic audience, as always, and very special for me that after so long to see your wonderful faces. I can see all the smiling eyes behind those masks. So all the best. Thank you. Peter Doherty.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Sally.
Pleasure.
And thank you, Minister, for your remarks. And I hope it's over.
The pandemic? Yeah.